another point that I wish to make to you. Let's fast forward this for one generation. There was another student of Rabbeinu HaKodesh, and his name was Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said that if the previous generations, meaning the generation of Rabbeinu HaKodesh, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who's the author, the editor of the Mishnah, if the previous generation are considered like angels, then we can consider ourselves like human beings. But if we consider them like human beings, then you know what we must consider ourselves? We must consider ourselves like donkeys. And not like the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yor, who was a special donkey. You could tell the difference between things that were kosher and unkosher. We're just donkeys. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said about himself if we considered Rabbeinu HaKodesh a human being. So I want to ask you, after this statement, or set of statements in Sanhedrin 98b, what do you think the students of Rabbi Yochanan said about him? That he was Rabbeinu HaKodesh's donkey? No. They said exactly like Devei Rab Shila, Devei Rab Yanai, Devei Rab Chanina, and Devei Chizkiah. Said exactly the same thing. His name is Yochanan. That's Mashiach. Now that's strange. If he's Rabbeinu HaKodesh's donkey, how can he change into Rabbeinu HaKodesh's teacher? Because if he's the Messiah, Rabbeinu HaKodesh will rise up from the dead, and the Messiah will be teaching all the people, including Rabbeinu HaKodesh. How can the donkey of Rabbeinu HaKodesh become his teacher? So the answer is as follows. Our humility must convince us that we are nothing compared to the previous generations. However, that's for us, for the teachers of the generation. We must feel ourselves inadequate in comparison to the previous generations. But the students don't know the previous generation. Students are obligated to hold their teacher, that if Mashiach was supposed to come, it's going to be their teacher. And in fact, that's the way it's going to be. It's not a question of humility, and it's not a question of inadequacy. Each generation has its own unique set of challenges. A Rav who is in this generation and is a Rav according to the Torah might have had greater tests for his personality, for his study of Torah, than the previous generations. And as a result of that, is more worthy than the previous generation. We just don't know that. However, the Rav himself must feel humble to those that preceded him, for his whole tradition comes from them. And so, I concluded with my interlocutor that the Rebbe can hold himself in humility to the previous generations. But we Hasidim are obligated to believe that if Messiah was to come, it would be him. And if that's the case, then he's greater than the Ramon, he's greater than Beis Yosef, he's greater than Rashi, and he's greater than Rabbeinu HaKodesh, and he's greater than Avraham Avinu. Because if he's going to be the Messiah, he's greater than all of them. But how could that be? The answer is, each generation has its own challenges. And each generation accomplishes more than the previous generation, for whatever reason God sees fit. Another thing I wrote him was that even if you were to say that the students must believe that the present generation of teachers do not compare to the previous generation of teachers, nonetheless, you must admit that there are exceptions. For example, the Vilna Goy, Rabbeinu Eliyahu of Vilna, was considered by his students to be on par with those who preceded him by several hundred years. That's a fact. Even if they said Ulai, I am certain that among his students, there were those who said certainly he's like the Rishonim. Truth be told, the Vilna Gaon was not afraid to argue with the Rambam and to be disparaging of him for whatever reason. But he disagreed with him vehemently in certain spiritual matters. Does that mean that the Rambam was smaller? No. It means that the Vilna Gaon felt comfortable arguing with him and disagreeing and coming to different conclusions. He was not intimidated by the fact that the Rambam preceded him by over 500 years, almost 600 years. So there is such a thing as a Yotzim and a Klal, an exception to the rule. The Ari, for example, was also an exception to the rule, greater than all the Kabbalists that preceded him, except for the author of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was considered the greatest and holiest of all the Talmudic, the Tanaic sages, as is stated in several places, both in the Zohar and in the Talmud, the greatness of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So how could he be greater than Hillel, greater than the Yochanan, than the Yosis, greater than Antigonos Ish-Socha, greater than Shimon Atzah? How could that be? How could he be greater than all of them? And the answer is Yotzei min haklal. There are exceptions to the rule. And so I wrote him, what does it bother you that I consider my Rebbe an exception to the rule? You may not consider him, but I do. What's your problem? And I showed him that, in fact, the holy Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Horadok writes about the Baal Shem Tov that he was greater than all who preceded him, from the original ones, including the Tanaim and the Amoraim, including the prophets. In certain ways, he was greater than all of them. He considered his Rebbe a Yotzim in Aklal. So, what do you think he did with my letter? He threw it away and called me a heretic. And he never responded to my arguments. Such is the nature of those people who call other people heretics. They never listen to someone else. They only think that their opinion counts, nobody else's. Guess what? There are different opinions in the traditions of the Torah. And just because a person has a different position does not make him a heretic, or her a heretic for that matter.